There is an island in our land so feared that France used it as a graveyard for its guilty conscience, where thousands vanished, and one man, Alfred Dreyfus, was buried alive on Devil's Island for a crime he didn't commit. How did South America become the empire's secret prison? And why did this tiny rock nearly tear France apart? Stay with me. This story walks in chains. I'm Arturo, and this is LatinLora. From Latin America's history to its mysteries, true crime, and local legends, I bring you stories that whisper with Latin intrigue. Hit subscribe, new revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. The sky over the Atlantic is the color of old iron, the rain comes sideways, and a small launch cuts through the waves toward a black rock that looks like it wants to spit men back into the sea. On that launch, wrists rubbed raw by iron, uniform torn of its honors, sits a man who still cannot believe what has happened to him. His name is Alfred Dreyfus, captain of the French army, son of Jewish textile merchants from faraway Alsace, and he is about to disappear from Europe and reappear here, on our side of the ocean, on a place the French call Ile du Diable, Devil's Island. It's a long way from Paris to this island prison in South America. French Guiana's Devil's Island has witnessed some of humanity's hardest moments, from the brutalities of slavery to the punishments of penal servitude. Guards wait on the shore, rifles slung, rain dripping off their hats, chains clink in rhythm with the surf. And you know what hurts the most? This man's most serious crime is not what he did, but what he was. Jewish, ambitious, from a contested borderland, too easy to blame when a nervous empire needs a traitor. As he steps onto the slippery rock that will be his world, he does not know that this island has already eaten thousands of men whose names will never appear in any Parisian newspaper. To France, he is a scandal to be buried. To the jungle, he is just one more body. How did this rock off the coast of South America become the place where France tried to bury its guilt? To answer that, we have to pull the camera back from Dreyfus's terrified eyes and look at the long shadow behind him, French Guiana itself. On European maps, it is a thin green strip on the northern coast of South America, squeezed between Suriname and Brazil, politely labeled an overseas department. But for centuries, for empires, this corner of our continent was a laboratory for their dreams and their fears. Spaniards brushed this coastline around 1500, chased mirages of El Dorado, and retreated before disease and resistance. French merchants followed, planting footholds at Sinnamary and Cayenne. The Dutch swooped in and out. Treaties in faraway Europe decided who owned what, while the land watched and waited. Attempts to fill the territory with free European colonists mostly failed. They arrived with pamphlets full of promises and sailed back in coffins. The sun was too harsh, the forest too thick, the soil too wild, and our continent has never liked to be tamed by letterhead. So the colony limped along, relying on enslaved Africans to make plantations and towns survive. A formidable nun, Anne-Marie Javouhet, briefly tried another way at Mana, building communities and schools for freed black people and women. Still, empires do not like experiments they do not design. In 1848, France finally abolished slavery in its colonies. On the surface, it was a moral triumph. Beneath the surface, colonial administrators panicked. Who would cut the trees, dig the canals, carry the stones, clear the swamps? In Paris, under Napoleon III and the Second Empire, a cold idea took shape. If free settlers refused to come and slavery was no longer acceptable, then France would send those it considered its own waste. Thus was born the great experiment of penal colonization. The law of May 30th, 1854, the law on transportation, changed everything. Until then, men sentenced to hard labor rotted in port prisons on France's own coast. With the new law, the empire looked outward. Hard labor would now be carried out in the colonies. Specifically, in our lands of South America, in French Guiana, far, humid, and already scarred by failed settlements, was chosen as one of the main dumping grounds. The logic was simple and cruel. Get rid of convicts from the metropolis, flood the colony with a cheap workforce, and, in the long term, turn the most deserving prisoners into settlers who would populate and develop this stubborn piece of territory. To ensure they never returned, the lawmakers invented a mechanism called doublage. If you were sentenced to less than 8 years of hard labor, you had to stay in Guyana for an extra period equal to your sentence. If you were sentenced to more than 8 years, you were chained to the colony for life. Your punishment was not just years in irons. Your punishment was exile itself, written into law. Decades later, this same machine would swallow a Jewish captain named Alfred Dreyfus and spit him out on Devil's Island. But long before him, the ships began to arrive. On May 10th, 1852, the first convoy of transportes disembarked in the Ile du Salut, the Salvation Islands, off Kourou. The name itself is a bitter joke. No, salvation. For whom? From there, convicts were ferried to the mainland, to what they called the Grande Terre, to hack out roads, clear forest, and build camps along the rivers. In 1857, on the banks of the Maroni, the convicts themselves founded Saint-Laurent-du-Maroni, a town whose birth certificate was stamped penitentiary. Around it, a web of camps spread along the river and into the interior, a carceral map drawn over our landscape, turning the jungle into the backdrop of a European nightmare. Over the decades, more than 70,000 French convicts would be sent to Guyana, tens of thousands of them condemned to hard labor. And in that number, we can already feel the logic of empire that Latin America knows too well. When a state wants to hide its violence, it sends it far away, to the edges of its maps, to islands, to jungles, to deserts that look very much like ours. Inside this machinery, every convict had a place. Those in the good class might work as servants in colonial families, as cooks, clerks, boatmen, even auxiliary guards, men with keys but not quite free. Those at the bottom were thrown into the hardest labor, felling giant trees in choking heat, digging ditches in swamps, working in quarries, turned into human tools to build the roads and docks that free colonists had never managed to create. If you behaved, you might hope for an assignment outside the main camp, maybe a small concession of land or a job with a private employer. If you resisted, if you tried to escape, if you struck back, the system had darker rooms inside its dark house, disciplinary camps buried deeper in the forest, special courts that could add years of punishment, solitary cells on the islands where the only sound was the jungle and your own breath. Imagine, mi hermano, you are a petty thief from Marseille, condemned again and again until the judges decide you are no longer a man, but a category. A repeat offender, fit not for prison, but for erasure. By a law of 1885, you become a relégué, a relegated man. Your punishment is perpetual. If you have skills, contacts, maybe you can secure a bit of individual relegation, some room to move, a chance to work and feed yourself. If you have nothing, like most, you are thrown into collective relegation in camps strung along the Maroni, where men hacked at the forest until their bodies gave out. Alongside you walks a rebel from Kabylia in Algeria, deported for resisting French rule. A man from Martinique or Guadeloupe shipped here as a colonial prisoner. An Indochinese militant brought across 2 oceans for daring to dream of independence. There were even women locked in a convent penitentiary run by nuns and groomed to become wives for male convicts, until mortality among them became so high that the experiment was quietly abandoned. Later, in the 1930s, more than 500 Indochinese prisoners, most of them condemned for political reasons, were brought to special camps in the interior territory of Inini, a district carved out and placed directly under the governor. Twice colonized, first at home in Asia, then again in South America, they did not always submit. Revolts, refusals, hunger strikes, their presence is a reminder that even in hell there is resistance. All of this, the classifications, the camps, the doublage, the relegation, formed the world that waited for Alfred Dreyfus when he was condemned. Let's go back to him. Born in Mulhouse in 1859 into a Jewish family from Alsace, he entered the École Polytechnique in 1882 and chose a military career, rising to the rank of captain by 1889. In the 1890s, he worked at the War Ministry, inside a France obsessed with the German threat after its defeat in 1870. When an unsigned letter, the famous bordereau, was found, suggesting that someone in the army was selling secrets to the German military attaché, suspicion fell quickly and heavily on Dreyfus. A Jew from a border region, ambitious, for nervous nationalists and virulent antisemites, he was the perfect suspect. Arrested in October 1894, he was court-martialed in December in a trial full of secret evidence and bad faith. He was convicted of treason and sentenced to life imprisonment. Public opinion, whipped up by a press where anti-Semitic papers shouted about Jewish conspiracies, rejoiced. In January 1895, he was degraded in a public ceremony, insignias ripped from his uniform, sword broken, and then, in April, they shipped him across the Atlantic into the system we have just seen. On April 13, 1895, he entered the penal colony of Devil's Island. Isolated in a tiny hut, guarded constantly, forbidden from talking to anyone but his jailers, he lived not as a beast of burden like many other convicts, but as a ghost. While chain gangs sweated on the mainland, he stared at the sea, unsure if anyone in France still believed in his innocence. But France had not finished with him. Back in Paris, Lieutenant Colonel Georges Picard, head of military intelligence, noticed something that did not fit. Another officer, Ferdinand Valsin-Esterhazy, seemed to be the real author of the incriminating letter. The handwriting matched, the profile fit. When Picard pushed this uncomfortable truth, he was reassigned, then pushed aside. The army preferred a stable lie to a dangerous truth. Yet rumors began to spread. An officer quietly forged additional documents to support the original conviction. Esterhazy was eventually brought to trial and acquitted in a farce of a court-martial. Picard himself was arrested, and while all this played out under the lamps of Paris on Devil's Island, Dreyfus still walked in circles inside his tiny enclosure, the Atlantic wind answering every question with the same salty silence. Then, one morning in January 1898, a headline exploded over France. J'accuse. Émile Zola, one of the most famous writers of his time, had published an open letter on the front page of the newspaper L'Aurore. In it, he accused the Army High Command of framing an innocent man, of forging evidence, of condemning Dreyfus to save its own honor. Hundreds of thousands read it in cafes and on trams. And while Zola risked prison in Paris, Dreyfus stared at the sea, not knowing any of this. His fate debated like an equation while ants climbed the walls of his cell. France is split into two. On one side, the anti-Dreyfusards, nationalists, monarchists, many Catholic conservatives, and open antisemites. For them, reopening the case was a betrayal of the army and the nation, a victory for Germany and for international jury. On the other side, the Dreyfusards, Republicans, socialists, intellectuals, people who insisted that the Republic could not sacrifice an individual to protect an institution's prestige. Petitions circulated, riots broke out, Parliament thundered. Zola himself was tried for libel, convicted, and sentenced to prison and a heavy fine. He fled into exile in England. This is the part, mi hermano, that France likes to remember now with some pride. The brave writer, the intellectuals, the eventual triumph of justice. But we, telling this story from the other side of the ocean, cannot forget that while France debated its soul, our land was still being used as its oubliette, its place of forgetting. The first crack in the wall came when the forger confessed to his lies and then killed himself in his cell. The scandal was too big to contain. Eventually, the government decided the affair had to be resolved. Dreyfus was brought back from Devil's Island. Imagine that journey after years of isolation, seeing the French coast again, not as home, but as a courtroom, retried in Rennes in 1899. Incredibly, the court found him guilty again, this time with extenuating circumstances, as if treason could be half true. The President of the Republic intervened and granted him a pardon. Dreyfus accepted to escape the nightmare, but refused to let the lie stand in history. He and his supporters kept fighting, and in 1906, France's highest court finally annulled the previous judgments and declared him innocent. He was reinstated in the army and decorated with the Légion d'honneur. He served for a time, then retired, only to be called back during the First World War to command an ammunition column. He died in Paris in 1935, an older man who had seen his name become a symbol. The army that had broken him would not officially acknowledge its fault until 1995. By then, Devil's Island had long since stopped receiving prisoners. The penal colony itself had been dying for decades. Its death began, in a way, with another visitor from Europe, the journalist Albert Londres, who traveled to Guiana in the 1920s and wrote about what he saw. His reports pierced the veil. France learned that its faraway laboratory of punishment was not regenerating souls through work, as the brochures promised, but simply grinding men down in disease and despair and costing a fortune while doing it, since the colony never became self-sufficient and had to be fed and financed from the metropolis. In 1933, the Salvation Army arrived to help men who had finished their sentences but were trapped by doublage, forced to remain in Guiana without money, family, or hope, and to campaign in France for abolition. From within Guiana, the deputy Gaston Monerville added his voice, denouncing this system operating on our soil. Under this pressure, the French government finally acted. A decree law of 1938 abolished transportation to Guiana. No new convicts would be sent as transportés. Relegation limped on until after the Second World War, when it too was abolished. In the 1940s, a new director of the prison service, Dr. Lieutenant Colonel Sainz, was given one mission: to liquidate the system. He organized convoys to repatriate convicts and former convicts to France and Algeria. The last ship carrying them away from Guyana left in the early 1950s. A few years later, the territory was turned into a French department. Later, it gained regional status. On paper, French Guiana today is as French as Normandy. But if you walk along the Maroni or stand on the cliffs of the old camps, the earth tells a different story. For us, as Latin Americans, French Guiana is a strange neighbor, a piece of Europe nailed into our continent, where rockets now blast off from Kourou's spaceport over the same coast where shackled men once stumbled ashore. The penal colony there speaks to our own histories: Spanish presidios, Portuguese plantations, our dictatorship's secret prisons in the jungle or on islands. It is all the same instinct, dressed in different uniforms. When power is afraid, it exports what it fears: the poor, the rebels, the inconvenient, to places it considers empty, even when those places are full of life. It believes that distance will erase responsibility, but the forest remembers, the sea remembers. Devil's Island remembers the footsteps of Alfred Dreyfus, just as the Maroni remembers the songs of Algerian rebels and Indochinese prisoners. And we, telling this story around our metaphorical campfire, remember too. That is why, when France celebrates the Dreyfus Affair as a victory of justice over antisemitism, we nod, because that victory matters. Still, we also quietly add the rest of the sentence, that this drama of conscience was staged in part on our land, under our storms, using our remoteness as a curtain behind which the Republic could hide what it did not wish to see. In the end, mi hermano, truth is not a cold statue standing in a European square. It is a living thing, always told from somewhere, in some language, with some wounds in mind. The story of the penal colony of French Guiana and the fate of Alfred Dreyfus is not just a French story. It is a Latin American story too, because the jungle heard the chains, the rivers carried the bodies, and the islands held the silence. And by speaking their names, the anonymous transportés, the relégués, the women in the convent penitentiary, the Indochinese rebels, the Jewish captain gazing at the horizon, we refuse to let our continent remain just the back room of someone else's history. We place the camera back where it belongs, on our shore, watching the boats arrive and asking each time not only, who is this man, but what kind of world would rather throw him into the jungle than face its own reflection? Muchas gracias for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story follows you into your dreams, subscribe and ring the bell, because the darkest stories of Latin America are far from over.